I want to hear more about the schema changes in V4. It's the most substantial module change in the ecosystem, right? I mean, I'm not sure if it's the most substantial, but it certainly is an enormous refactor from V3, especially like under the hood.
Mhm.
If you're using schema like basic schema, you're like if you're not doing any complex transformations and you're just kind of like using the basic features of schema, it should feel relatively familiar.
Mhm.
Like um the names of things and whatnot haven't changed drastically. I think
Yeah.
some of like the coolest stuff um, with schema that Julia was able to incorporate surrounds like this map fields combinator. I mean, it's
Mhm.
not the coolest, but I think like something
It's
that
one of
impact.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, probably like many of the questions we've gotten in the past about how do I do X with
Yeah.
schema have now been addressed by this being ability to map fields and get a new schema out of that. For example, like there was a question in Discord the other day about, or maybe it wasn't in Discord, maybe Mattia gave the example, I don't remember, but like about taking
Yeah. Yeah.
a structure schema and like
Oh yeah.
making all of the keys optional or
Optional.
something like that,
Yeah.
right, Mattia? Like
Yeah. Yeah. It was
now
both
you,
something we mentioned that we had also like a question in the Discord channel. Um, and yeah, but I would say also like one phrase that Julio said to me, and I think that like summarizes all of the changes in schema is more like the internals of schema have now been arranged in a more like sensible and more reasonable way. From a consumer part of side, you'll see some API changes, but like the most like powerful of the new V4 schema compared to the V3 one comes from the internal rearrangements, I would say.
yeah, I like also the re-encoding of variants and whatnot. This is like a little
Mhm.
more technical, but and I also don't have like the best understanding of like this refactor because I uh didn't take the time to like look into it yet, but the base schema type, like the I think it's called bottom, I think,
Mhm.
in V4, has like 14 type parameters or something like that.
Yeah.
But for people defining methods that like take in a schema and like I don't know, use that schema to do something or whatever, um, like putting generic constraints on a
Mhm.
schema is much easier now when you're defining methods. Um, just by like making the generic constraint like extends schema.top because schema.top is like the top schema. It's like
The father of
most
them all.
the father of them all, yes. um, but then you can like go a step down from that and you can use schema.codec, which allows
Mm.
you to define like constraints on the input and output types of that schema. So if you like want to create a generic constraint in a method that you're defining that also constrains the input and output types of the schema, you can do that with schema.codec, which is nice. So like defining APIs that consume schemas in a generic way is much easier now, in my opinion. Um, I hope Dylan picks up the Effect Cloudflare library again. Indeed.
Mm.
I don't know if Dylan's still here or if he left already, but Dylan, we want Effect Cloudflare. I know Schema V4 supports effectful transforms. Can you that actually was supported
Mm.
in V3 too, I believe. Can you
Mm.
give an example of the usefulness of effectful schemas? Because I end up only using schema for object validation, but I can't think of use cases. I mean, I think there's plenty of use cases where you may want to have an effectful transformation um, in your like schema. So you can imagine that like you're doing a transformation with your schema and you want to embed in that transformation logic that like fetches some information from an API and then uses that information to further inform the transformation that you're doing. Like maybe, I don't know, a well-known endpoint on some API or maybe like something, I don't know. You can
Mm.
imagine.
The
Yeah.
normalizing
So
API. Yeah.
there are I can't like think of like a concrete use case right now. Maybe Mattia can.
One 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 use case I had, but maybe it was more like an abuse of schema. It was like a JWT token that's encrypted. You can define a schema that basically takes in the string and then decodes all of the way into the structure, and also like provide the encoding back. That is effectful because you have to basically encode and decode. You need like a service in the context to know the key for the encryption or whatever. So that's kind of one. It's not like the asynchronous like transformation you would expect from an effect, but still, like it's an example of trying to transform something
No,
effectively from a string
that's a
into.
good point too. Like I think
Um,
it like tracking the services that are used in an effectful transformation is pretty nice. So like your decode and encode, like your transformations can access the effect context. So if you have like, I
mhm,
don't know, some service that you want to like have a test implementation of in testing, like because schema has the ability to do effectful transforms and effectful filters and whatnot, you can ingest in like you can leverage the dependency injection that effect provides within your schema transforms as well. So I think it like go ahead,
just
Matthias. Sorry.
And I was saying exactly one example of that is, for example, if you have like structure that have like fields that you have like an user ID and you want like a specific brand that is an existing user ID, you can maybe encode as a schema this transformation from a user ID to an existing user ID, and that would require to provide also a service that is used in order like to ensure that that provided user ID is actually existing for the filtering, as you mentioned. And that's like awesome because now you can like now in V4 you have like different like um context tracking for the encoding and the decoding, whereas in V3 was the same encoding, the same context tracking for both encoding and decoding. So one change in here, for example, would be that when you decode, you expect to have the service to ensure that that user ID exists. But on the other way around, if you have an existing user ID, that is also like a valid user ID as well. So you will have like a schema that has the user service for the decoding services, but won't have anything for the encoding one because again, an existing user ID is a valid user ID as well.
And yeah, Carnalut, it was revamped in V4 and enhanced. So like Mattia said, you can track, for example, like in V4, you can actually track dependencies used by the encoding and decoding sides of the schema separately. So like if we go to packages, effect, here's schema, and then we go to like decoding services. So I think it's only in two places, but you can see all the generic type parameters here at the bottom type of schema. Uh, just a couple,
Just a couple of generics.
but we track these separate, like they're tracked separately now, which is nice. So like you can express services that are only relevant for decoding, which is kind of cool. But yeah, there are definitely use cases for effectful transforms in transformations and in filters and whatnot. But it kind of it's very specific to like your domain and what you want to embed in the schema versus what you want to do outside of in your business logic. So
The fact that you now have like separate like services for the encoding and decoding parallel also like allows you to leverage more schema in order to like to build your data-driven domain. You know, things like, as we mentioned before, try to leverage schema also like to define things in your domain, because now we can inject service that can be used in construction, transforming, and whatever.
what else? What else? Yeah, another good example that Darker's
Specifically,
Better
or
provided was like if your schema has to be more strict on decoding or encoding based on an environment, the environment you're running in, you need to dynamically look up like maybe a service or something like that, whatever. So we kind of talked about this, but can you talk about what you plan to achieve from v4 schema.define generation, runtime, and friends. I'm not exactly sure I understand the question 100%, but we can maybe talk about um, the schema. What is it called? Schema representation, which I think is a really cool
Mhm.
enhancement in 4.0. And this is already used quite a bit under the hood in different places within like Effect. Um, and basically, the schema representation module is able to take a schema and convert it into a portable data structure and back. So you can use this schema representation thing to, for example, like send an actual effect schema over the network. So if you want to like take a schema on your server and like send it to your client and then let the client use it, you can convert the schema into a schema representation, send it over the wire, and then convert it back, which I think is pretty cool. You can use it to store schemas on disk, which you can imagine for use cases like different storage formats like Avro and other things that store schemas alongside the data that they represent. We're using this module, I think, in the Effect AI SDKs now, do like some fancy stuff with like JSON schema conversion. Um, Code generation is possible because of this. Like it's a pretty cool feature.
Yeah.
Um, that V3 just like doesn't have it all.
Mhm. It's one of those things we mentioned before that from the V4 version rewrite, like it comes out that this schema representation becomes kind of like the core of giving a lot of possibilities, all baked by the same like abstraction behind the scene, which is really, really cool.
Are are we talking about the graph module, Sebastian?
Oh, oh, are we talking about the graph
Yes,
model? Yes,
one of the
indeed.
best modules in Effect, Sebastian. Um, Trying to see if I missed any questions. If I missed any questions, please spam
Mm.
it again into chat. Hello, Alex. I'm sorry I missed your saying hello to you. Um, is STM used in cluster and workflow? It sounds like
Statron?
that. No, I don't believe that we currently leverage
Yep.
STM in cluster or workflow. Could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure we don't.
Um, if they travel over the wire, do they reference service dependencies by identifier? There are some restrictions of what travel over the wire, because obviously you cannot like encode everything. You cannot like encode a function over the wire. But yeah, you can like, given some like, let's say some restriction, you can like transform your schema over and send it over the wire.
Yeah, and that's actually documented here in this like limitations section of the schema representation like section here. But basically,
Yeah.
anything that can't be serialized is not supported. So transformations,
Yeah.
built-in checks actually can be represented, but custom predicates can't be.